But then, as soon as that momentum goes away and the skull stops, the brain is still accelerating. And so that accelerating brain tissue smashes into the inside of the skull, and so you get that acceleration followed by a rapid deceleration that imparts those dangerous forces through the brain tissue. Welcome back, everybody. I'm Dr. Brian Sutterer, and this is your #1 source for learning about the unique medical side of the world of sports. In this video, we're gonna break down what led to such a vicious knockout and then talk about the physiology of concussions. We'll also touch briefly on why fights like this actually are harder for me to watch from just a health and safety standpoint than something like mixed martial arts. As always, if you enjoy learning about this unique side of sports, then please consider subscribing to my channel and be sure and go follow me over on Twitter for more real-time breakdowns and analysis, and let's get started. I want to touch first on two main technical points that led to this being such a vicious knockout. The first is that Santa Cruz is not expecting this punch. We can see he's coming here with his right, and as we advance forward, he has no idea that this left uppercut is coming from Davis. Because he doesn't expect that it's coming, it doesn't allow the muscles around his neck to basically brace up to help absorb some of the impact that's soon to be transmitted into the skull and subsequently into the brain. The second part of this, as we continue the punch coming around here, is the massive rotational component of Davis's punch. If we back this up here, we can see Santa Cruz's face goes from pointing basically directly down, maybe a little bit to the right, to when Davis's punch comes up in a split second, gets this massive rotational load applied to his head, to his neck, and subsequently to his brain, which is going to be the major factor in why this was more prolonged of an unconscious period and more severe of a concussion. What's basically happening inside Santa Cruz's brain here that leads to the cascade of events that cause him to go unconscious and leads to this concussion is the fact that his brain is subject to these rotational and acceleration, deceleration forces after he receives this punch. Essentially, this punch from Davis causes a resulting force to be transmitted throughout the entirety of Santa Cruz's brain that starts this cascade of events that leads to him being unconscious and everything we see subsequently with the concussion. This is our brain, and we've got the skin transparent here so you can kind of see the main structures, but the key concept here is that the brain is basically floating in the cerebral spinal fluid, or the CSF. That's that clear liquid that drains out when somebody does a lumbar puncture, and it essentially bathes here in the blue the entirety of the brain, the cerebellum, the brainstem, all the way down into the spinal cord itself. So you have this brain tissue that's basically floating and has room to move back and forth inside of the skull. The brain tissue is not rigid and flat up against the side of the skull. There's room to move, and because there's room to move, that means the brain can sort of bang into the side of the skull if we have some sort of external insult, like a punch from Gervonta Davis. What we primarily see is an acceleration followed by a deceleration of the brain within the skull that causes subsequent damage to the actual neurons and axons that we see within the brain. So just before Santa Cruz receives this punch here, the brain is basically in a neutral position, floating in CSF. If you remember back from physics, an object at rest has a tendency to stay at rest until an external force is applied. So as soon as that punch is transmitted, that massive impulse of force gets delivered through the head, we can initially see Santa Cruz's head basically start to move and rotate up to his left. But in this position, the skull is moving before the brain starts to move. And this is on the order of, milliseconds, if not less. But the brain tissue itself is stationary, and the skull initially moves into the brain tissue. So initially, you're going to have the frontal and kind of right-sided parietal lobe of Santa Cruz's brain basically being knocked into his right side of the skull. But then as his head continues to whip around here, now as he starts to move, suddenly the brain catches up. So the brain goes from at rest to this acceleration and starts to spin and starts to move backward because of that momentum that's being transferred through the skull. But then, as soon as that momentum goes away and the skull stops, the brain is still accelerating. And so that accelerating brain tissue smashes into the inside of the skull, and so you get that acceleration followed by a rapid deceleration that imparts those dangerous forces through the brain tissue. This is an example of one of the many neurons that we actually have within the brain. Electrical signals arrive to sort of the beginning of the nerve cell here and then are transmitted down through sort of the highway of the nerve cell that we call the axon. That axon then terminates on additional neurons in the brain, and where they terminate, there's release of these neurotransmitters that help to kind of send these signals along through the different tissues. These are things like dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin, things you've probably heard about. These normally function by sending electrical signals through this entire pathway. But what happens whenever you have this sudden acceleration and deceleration is you can get actual stretching, tearing, damage of these neurons within the brain, and you get this initial massive depolarization or sort of electrical charge that gets sent through these cells in the brain. That's essentially what we think is causing you to go unconscious. It's this massive sort of reset switch that gets flipped within the brain from this huge influx of ions into these nerve cells that cause them to massively depolarize and send all this electrical signal through at once, and the brain doesn't know what to do, and so it basically resets. The problem then that happens following that is you get massive release of all those neurotransmitters like the norepinephrine, the dopamine, the serotonin, from these nerve terminals that just flood into your brain. And on top of all that, you get abnormalities in the different ion transport channels within these nerve cells that can cause subsequent swelling and even more damage and death on a microscopic level to some of these neurons. This whole sequence of events is happening as soon as that force is delivered and we see that brain start to move. And I mean, this is a brain injury. We can call it a concussion, but it essentially is an injury to the brain. As we know from research, everybody responds differently to concussions. There seem to be different factors that play into the long-term risks, but there's no doubt about it. This is a brain injury. As you watch this punch, it's just crazy to think of that insane rotational force that's being transmitted not just into the brain, but even all the way down to the brainstem and through Santa Cruz's neck. I mean, he goes in a split second from looking straight ahead to everything being swung in the opposite direction with massive amounts of torque and shear force delivered through those brain tissues. I said in the beginning, fights like this are honestly harder for me to watch just as a medical provider than something like mixed martial arts. I feel like with boxing, guys are just so skilled at trying to deliver as much power as possible to someone's head. Mixed martial arts, you have different techniques. You've got wrestling, you've got submissions, you've got other things that these fighters are trying to do beyond just punch someone in the face and make them go unconscious. Nonetheless, I still think they're professional athletes. They need medical care, and so learning how to take care of boxers, I think, is just important as learning how to take care of football players, basketball players, cheerleaders, or so on. But these are tough for me to watch and see, knowing that even aside from the massive hit that put Santa Cruz unconscious, all those subconcussive blows that these guys are getting, as we've seen from research with football, we definitely have to be worried about long-term risks. But anyways, I hope this was educational to teach you guys a little bit about what's happening physiologically here within the brain for a concussion, how these rotational forces come into play. Let me know below your thoughts regarding boxing versus MMA. Do you think one's worse than the other? One's more safe? Are they both too dangerous? Let me know what you think, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.